We're back here on the Lynne Hayes-Freeland Show. We're talking about our town, Smoketown, but it's from the book, The Untold Story of Smoketown, the Other Great Black Renaissance. The author, Mark Whitaker, is here. So I want to go back just a little bit because you're looking through the Teenie Harris archives online. Mm-hmm. You see your grandparents. You start to see your history there. Right. Do people truly appreciate the history that's documented through like the Teenie Harris collection?
Well, you know, we've talked a lot about music and you know, we could talk about sports, and I think a lot of people know, you know, some of the great sports stories that are associated with Black Pittsburgh during that era. But I think another thing that I think people don't know and are discovering through the book is the amount of political influence that Black Pittsburgh had through the Courier, which by the 1930s had overtaken the Chicago Defender to become the largest and most influential black newspaper in the country. So, a couple of things. One, in the early 30s, the Courier and Robert Vann, its editor, started to call on black folks to switch their allegiance from the Republican Party. I mean, it's hard to imagine now, but blacks voted overwhelmingly Republican in that era, out of loyalty to Abraham Lincoln. Right. Vann thought they had, you know, the Republicans were taking the black vote for granted. Does that sound familiar in terms of some of our current debates, right? Okay. And he said, look, you know, let's see what Democrats will do for us. And so he gave a speech in 1932, which didn't move the black vote nationally in huge numbers, but it moved the black vote in Western Pennsylvania. And when Roosevelt saw that, he started to put a lot of effort behind courting black voters, which resulted in 1936 with this huge exodus, this huge change of the black vote from the Republican to the Democratic column, which was changed American politics, right? The Courier was also at the forefront of advocating for opportunities for black soldiers, for combat roles for black soldiers, leading into World War II. And then once we entered the war after Pearl Harbor, it led the Double Victory campaign to rally black support around the country for the war in exchange for the promise that after the war there would be more opportunity for black folks. Very sadly, and it's a big part of the story too, that didn't materialize. It didn't happen. And it was a big factor, I think, leading up to the civil rights movement that isn't paid enough attention to. But during the war, the Courier also sent more correspondence, accredited war correspondence, to cover black soldiers in the field than any other newspaper in the world. And that's a distinction that Frank Bolden wore proudly. Yeah, so Frank Bolden, as you know, anybody who knows Pittsburgh knows the name Frank Bolden, because he was this legendary amateur historian, raconteur, great wordsmith. He had all these colorful phrases for sort of life on the Hill. What not everybody knows is that he spent the war years covering black soldiers. And, you know, I write about, particularly about how he went to the Pacific and covered the black soldiers who were building what was called the Lido Road in the Pacific, which was the largest engineering project probably in the entire during the entire war effort, and the largest deployment in terms of numbers of black soldiers during the war to carve this road through Burma. Just, you know, hellish conditions which he conjured up, you know, very eloquently in his writing. So you know, he had a fascinating life. He also documented the harassment that the Courier got during the war from the Roosevelt administration, who thought that all of this advocating for a double victory was sort of, you know, actually suppressing support for the war. It was actually doing the opposite. But the Courier had to publish during that whole period under the threat of being investigated by Hoover and the FBI. Bolden himself was called back. He was at a base, at a training base in Arizona, and he was called back to be questioned by the FBI. So, you know, not only were they doing great journalism, they were doing it under a lot of pressure. A lot of pressure that people don't realize. And I want to bring this full circle now, because as you go through that whole Renaissance, you kind of land on August Wilson. Right. So, August Wilson is really interesting because in some ways he's probably, the crowning jewel of the crown jewel of this Renaissance in terms of his stature now and his association with the Hill, and the fact that he, set 9 of his 10 century cycle plays in the Hill. But the interesting thing is that the Hill you see in his plays is really the Hill after.
I was going to say, it's not the Hill we've been talking about, right?
Of Black Pittsburgh and, the tearing down of the lower hill in the name of urban renewal, the riots that happened in the 60s. It's a place where people are really hurting and struggling, which was very accurate in terms angry in terms of the world that he lived in as an adult, in the 60s and the 70s. But it doesn't really reflect, this heyday that I write about in my book. So, it was an interesting, I write with great respect and reverence for him, but I also say that if you only know your history, your Black history and your history of Black Pittsburgh through August Wilson's plays, you're not going to get the whole story. We got to take a commercial break. We're going to come back in just a second and wrap all this up. Don't go away when the Lynne Hayes-Freeland Show continues.